With so many cool heroes in Deadlock to choose from, I'm on a mission to learn them all. I'm going to spend 50 games with each character to discover what they can teach me and how they can help me become a better player. Afterwards, I'll discuss my findings on things like builds, positioning, playstyle, and of course, fun, all for the love of learning. So today, let's talk about Billy. As I head into each episode and each character, I'll naturally have different preconceptions or predictions on what the experience will be like. My initial views are always shaped by my experiences playing against a hero, and by the end of my time, I have a much different perspective having learned to play as a hero. It's not only fun to take this kind of analytical approach to things, it can also be quite surprising, and in constantly challenging my understanding of characters, I've been able to learn so much about the game as a whole. Billy has hands down been the biggest surprise for me in this regard, being a far more complex hero than I thought he would be. From an outside perspective, having only read his abilities and played against him, he seemed pretty straightforward. But in reality, Billy's kit is tightly woven together, built around strategically pressuring your opponents, conditioning them to make mistakes, and putting them in the blender when they do. It's a high-risk, high-reward style, and while I would sometimes take a swing and get deleted for it, when I saw that parry pop up when I expected it to, not many characters could stand up to the beatdown. It was such a fun and unique way to get to approach the game. Instead of focusing on the abilities a character might have to use against me, I had to focus on the actual player's behavior, noting things like when they would parry, how they would position, and how confident they would feel when fighting me. If I knocked them up, would they parry right away? If they did, do I think they're likely to hesitate next time? Do they square up when I approach, and do they melee me in response? Or if I rush them, will they start to scramble? So much of Billy's game plan revolves around these really interesting mind games, and while a lot of it can be attributed to Deadlock's fantastic melee system, Billy's design, for me, is what took it to another level. So, if you're unfamiliar with Billy, here's a quick rundown on his kit. His one is called Bashdown, where Billy slams his bat on the ground, dealing both spirit and melee damage while also knocking enemies up. When leveled, Bashdown gets an additional charge, gains increased radius, and changes to scale off of heavy melee damage instead of light melee, increasing the damage overall. Billy's 2 is Rising Ram, where he charges forward, knocking enemies into the air on contact and dealing spirit damage. The ability's cooldown is reduced by half when you make contact, and with a point invested, you'll also net 25% extra weapon damage for 5 seconds afterwards. When maxed out, Ram gets some extra duration, 10 seconds off its cooldown, and it deals an extra 10% of enemy max health in spirit damage. Billy's 3 is called Blasted, which is both an active and a passive ability with several benefits. On the passive side, anytime Billy melees a hero or neutral enemy, ammo is restored and the wrecked debuff is applied. Light melees restore about a third of Billy's mag, while a heavy melee will fully reload the magazine. When Blasted is activated, bullet damage is amplified against wrecked enemies, and landing a melee temporarily boosts Billy's max health, while also extending the duration of Blasted. There are a few specifics to note in regards to this, being that light melees will only boost half of the listed health in the ability, and bullet damage is not amplified on wrecked enemies unless you're in the active Blasted state. As you can see here at base, Blasted shows it gives 70 health on melee, which does happen on the heavy melee, but only 35 is restored on a light melee. You can stack these health boosts while Blasted, but the longer you maintain Blasted, the faster those stacks will fade. It's hard to quantify as the timer is a little bit funky, but it essentially operates on a cycle which prevents you from infinitely stacking hundreds of health points. In summary, Blasted allows Billy to reload and boosts his health through melees while also amplifying his bullet damage against wrecked enemies. While it's a lot of pieces to keep track of, it encourages Billy to melee to gain an advantage in the fight and gives opponents an opportunity to counter him through a parry. When leveled, you get extra movement speed while Blasted, increased amp, bonus health, and spirit scaling, and you'll also get a Bashdown charge refunded on activation. While rather complex, Blasted is an extremely powerful tool that acts as the foundation for Billy's kit. Finally, Billy's 4 is Chain Gang, where he chains himself to nearby enemies, which slows and restricts movement abilities before he yanks everyone in, dealing spirit damage. The chain can break if you lose line of sight of an enemy, but it can't be dispelled, including by a divine barrier. When leveled, it gets reduced cooldown, 40% resists, and at max will gain 5 extra meters in range, as well as 1.3 seconds of unstoppable per hero pulled in. The unstop activates after the pull, which gives you time to dish out some heavy melees without the threat of being stunned by a parry, and it makes Chain Gang a great ability for things like mid-boss or even even fighting under a patron. As I mentioned at the top, Billy is surprisingly complex, and I found there to be a much steeper learning curve with him than I had expected. It took me a couple games before I felt like I was really even using my abilities, and several more before I started to use them effectively. Even just finding the right places to try my melees was tough, and my patterns were far more obvious in the beginning than they needed to be, which got me parried more than a few times. Getting a dozen or so games under my belt, I realized how important that idea of patterns was, so I shifted my focus towards trying to condition my opponents and working to study their reactions. By varying things like my melee timing, positioning, or the order of my ability combo, I'd be able to take note of when enemies were trying to parry, successfully or not, and use that to try to open them up later. A great example is when I land my first ram on an enemy, I'll likely melee them mid-air, because regardless of if it works or if I get parried, it gives me valuable information that I could then form my strategy around. So let's say I land the melee and they don't parry. I can bash them down, stay in their face for a second before I back off and kind of see how they react to everything. Next time I ram them, I won't melee mid-air to see if they parry in anticipation. If they do, not only will I be able to punish them having baited the parry, but it'll signal to me that they'll be attempting to make adjustments, and I could potentially further condition them to different scenarios. With that, the dance would begin, as I would test out timings, rearrange or repeat scenarios, and just see if I could find any sort of cracks in my opponent's play. I found this to be a really interesting way to approach the game, and one so fundamentally different from how I had played prior. Previously, as I've taken different steps to learn the game, I put a lot of my focus into understanding things like enemy itemization or abilities, without realizing I was putting a separation between the characters I was facing and the players behind them. I'd still pick up basic things like an overly aggressive player or a high skill player, but I wasn't really thinking about more nuanced concepts like their bad habits or trying to condition them. It was easy for me to forget that while certain characters have strengths or weaknesses, so too do the players controlling them, and adapting my game plan to both will net me the most success. I'm a huge fan of fighting games, and I found myself thinking about them a lot during my time with Billy, specifically around those concepts of conditioning and studying my opponent. While in a fighting game, the character you'd be against would have certain capabilities or limitations, at the end of the day, they really act as an extension of the player using them, and you as a player are what's fighting them as a player. I think that's also the case in Deadlock, but just as in a fighting game, the complexity and density of everything else going on can make those small details tough to spot. This leads me to another concept I thought about a lot from fighting games called mental stack. Mental stack is essentially where you place your focus as a player, and in the face of several options or things to look out for, certain options will naturally gain more or less of that focus. For example, if your opponent jumps a lot or is playing a character with a lot of air moves, you might place a lot of your mental stack on anti-airing them, which might make you more susceptible to being surprised by a low attack. If that same opponent then tries to take advantage of that and begins to stay on the ground more, you might shift your mental stack to focusing on grounded mix-ups, which might make you less likely to anti-air than previously when your mental stack was focused on their air approach. Depending on the options available to both you and your opponent, your mental stack will change throughout a set, and as you improve as a player, it becomes stronger overall to cover more options consistently. I came to the realization while playing Billy that too much of my mental stack was focused on game mechanics and not enough on what was actually happening in the game in front of me. I had built up a good habit of itemizing around both my character and the characters I was facing, but in doing so, I had also formed some bad habits on overlooking how players were using those items or those characters. While at the end of the day, I don't think this is any sort of revelation, that is sort of how mental stack works. Regardless of skill level, everyone has different strengths and weaknesses, and everyone will develop and manage their mental stack differently, both consciously and subconsciously. Recognizing this means I can continue to improve in specific areas I identify as lacking, while taking note of my mental stack along the way to try and find better balance. As someone who's pretty analytical, moments like this are so helpful for my learning experience, as they not only give me direction on how I can continue to improve, they're also just extremely fun for me to think about. I love fighting games because they're so deep and because they're so thought-provoking, so I found it funny that I would come to the same conclusion about Deadlock, while playing a character I had once assumed was dumb. This kind of outcome is exactly why I wanted to do this series, as without pushing myself out of my comfort zone with characters like Billy, I wouldn't have learned as much as I already have about the game and about myself as a player. When it comes to building Billy, I think he's pretty straightforward, and he has a few different ways you could go about it. You could build more heavily into melee, focusing on dealing damage, or you could focus on sustain items to be tanky. While in an optimal team setting, Billy really shines as a tank that draws enemy fire, I ended up leaning into the brawler build as it was just more fun for me to play, and it generally got me better results in matchmaking. For my AP order, I always maxed bash down first to put out as much damage as I could, and I would usually max my ult second to help out in team fights. If for some reason I wasn't seeing that many team fights and I was doing a lot more solo brawling, I'd max blasted earlier, but I think bash down then ult is the way to go. Item wise, I like to start lane with melee lifesteal for some extra sustain before I go for my 4.8k gun spike. Opening rounds is a pretty popular option right now, but having tried a few different things out, I really liked going with extended mag, close quarters, slowing bullets, and melee charge. These items let me hit pretty hard, pretty fast, while also helping me lock people down with the slow. Afterwards, I would go for my green spike, upgrading melee lifesteal to life strike, as well as grabbing either battle vest or return fire. I think both are great options, as battle vest gets you a lot of bullet resist for cheap, as well as those conditional buffs that Billy can take advantage of easily through blasted. Return fire, however, is becoming a go-to for me, as the active effect is amazing to turn around a fight, and the 10% bullet resist it gives you is a great bonus. Regardless of whichever one I chose for my spike, I usually ended up getting both in most of the games I played. Finally, for my spirit investment, I kept it simple with improved spirit to up my ability damage and spirit snatch to get some extra juice for my melees. For most of my other items, I would try to counter buy, aside from some key upgrades to things like weighted shots, point blank, crushing fists, and boundless spirit. Phantom Strike was a great choice whenever I was playing into a flyer like Vindicta or Talon, and it also did extremely well against high mobility heroes like Mina, Lash, Apollo, or Celeste. Paired alongside the slow and movement ability restriction from Billy's ult, he has excellent utility to help the team shut down those heroes that can otherwise be extremely tough to kill. Rapid Recharge is also a great choice on Billy, as it nets you 4 total charges of bash down, and it lets you dish out a bunch of damage without needing to risk getting parried. It was usually an item I was willing to skip, however, depending on how many slots I had available or how defensive I was trying to play. If I was in a position where I was just looking for raw damage output though, it was an excellent choice. Finally, I think Colossus is a perfect fit for Billy, since I would usually find myself surrounded by enemies, and paired with the Unstoppable from his ult, I could do some serious work while both were active. I do think there are other options that could fill a similar role depending on what you're looking for, with things like Juggernaut, Inhibitor, or Siphon Bullets, but I found Colossus really fun to use, so I stuck with it. I really can't overstate how surprised I was by Billy and how much fun I had with him along the way. I'm generally not the type to enjoy tanks or close quarter characters, but something about Billy just really meshed with me. He felt extremely fluid to maneuver, his kit was such a blast to use, and as I mentioned earlier, he even managed to unlock a deeper layer of my gameplay. I'm generally a pretty stiff person, and one that can get overwhelmed in environments as intense as Deadlock, but on Billy I felt relaxed, smooth, and sharp. I felt like I was moving well, aiming well, and just generally feeling pretty good. While I step away from my time playing Billy with a lot to think about and a lot learned, I also walk away feeling more comfortable in my play, which feels like the biggest step of them all. Instead of being bound by my understanding of the game or by my preconceptions of its characters, I realize now that my knowledge should really just be an extension of myself and my play, as it would be in a fighting game. As I continue to improve and test myself, that comfort will come more naturally, and in recognizing the imbalances in my mental stack, I can identify my shortcomings, hopefully to continue learning and improving. There's a lot for me to take away from this episode, but the biggest thing is for me to just keep going, keep having fun, and see where the journey takes me. In the wise words of Billy, you don't gotta overthink it, just charge in. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comments what you think of Billy and what other heroes you might like to see me learn for the series. I've also put the build ID in the description for my Billy build if you're looking for a place to start. And if you enjoyed the video, you can subscribe to the channel to keep an eye out for more videos soon.